Welcome, everyone. We are joined today by Tosh Southwick, a consultant and founding partner of IR Potential. Tosh is with us today to speak on identifying key components of reconciliation and indigenization that must underpin any work to advance mental health for all Yukoners. Welcome, Tosh.
Thanks, Candace. Super appreciate the opportunity to share some thoughts and ideas about what that looks like to have a reconciliation lens and considerations of incorporating First Nation worldviews into this important conversation. So as Candace mentioned, I am one of the two co-owners of IRP Consulting, and IRP stands for Inspire Reconciliation Potential. My background is in Indigenous self-determination. I'm coming to you today from the traditional territories of the Tonquachin Council and the Kwanlin First Nation. But I'm a citizen of Kluwani First Nation, so about 3 hours northwest of Whitehorse, Yukon. I've had the honor and the privilege of working with Yukon First Nations throughout my career. And I really want to focus today's conversation on what do we talk about when we're talking about reconciliation lens to this important conversation. I'm going to do a short presentation, and then what I hope to have happen is some time for some questions, although if we don't get to all of them, I've been told there will be an opportunity to respond to them via email. So I'd encourage you to have some brave, honest conversations, and let's delve in. So in the work that my business partner, Davida Wood, and I do, we talk about reconciliation being on a cycle here, on a circular motion. I want to focus on two key components today, reconciliation and indigenization, that are very different, but very closely aligned and impact each other. So what does reconciliation look like in the context that we're talking about in terms of Yukon mental health and mental wellness? Well, first and foremost, it looks like, and this is not a new phrase to many of you, but it looks like nothing about us without us. It looks like making sure that First Nations are involved in every single part of the conversation, that we're not having things happen to us. And so often a good warning of this is if we see anything that we're being impacted by or affected by, then First Nations need to be directly involved in that conversation. It also looks like making sure that that happens from the start, that it isn't something that's an afterthought or halfway done through the process. So it looks like not taking a policy that's already been drafted to the First Nations without an initial conversation. It looks like making sure that First Nations are, in fact, part of the conversation right from the start. It looks like recognition that First Nation communities are way more adversely affected by the conversations that we're having and the realities that are happening in our territory. There are so many people in our communities who are living in the middle of a grief cycle. We don't even get to catch our breath before the next loss happens. It really broke my heart earlier this year when I talked to several people. And they said the same thing. They said they're scared when they wake up to start looking to see who might be passed next. And that is a really hard place to be in. And so a big part of a reconciliation lens in this conversation is absolutely understanding that First Nations are way more adversely affected by the mental health issues that are happening right now in the territory. It looks like understanding that trauma is the center of this conversation. That nobody wakes up in the morning and says, you know what, I think I'm going to become an addict today. That these are things that come because of trauma that many of our communities and our people have faced. That for many communities, suicide is a coping mechanism that's come about because of the intergenerational traumas that our communities have faced. And that we cannot do this work without a First Nation, and in this case, a Yukon First Nation idea of trauma-informed care. That what we're seeing play out here in the Yukon is connected deeply to systemic racism. This is not a health issue alone. It's connected to the things that we see in education systems and justice systems and many institutional. And it means that we have to look at the entirety of the system, and that we know that a lot of what's happening comes about because of that systemic racism. Having a reconciliation lens means that we're aware of that and that we're going to do something about it, that it's going to play into the conversations that we're having, the work that we're going to do. A reconciliation lens means we're going to look at the whole system, not just individual pieces. It means if we were going to look at these rocks, we're not going to just look at the ones that are highlighted here, because if we do that, we're going to miss the whole shoreline, the lake, the sky, all of these important factors that feed into the conversations and the work that we need to do. And so a reconciliation lens looks at the whole entire system and is inclusive of the First Nation systems that are at play as well. A reconciliation lens to this work looks like we're focusing on equity and justice, where most of the time the programs that we see that are offered in our communities are based off of equality. And often we hear conversations about reality. And if you take a scan of what's available in the Yukon right now, we are talking about very Whitehorse-centered programs. Very little of the work that we're doing is coming at it from an equity approach or a justice approach. And we would need to see some big shifts in that part. You're going to hear my dogs go in just a minute. They're piping in too. It looks like reconciliation lens looks like being aware that we can't continue to have just conversations. We can't produce more reports, that we need to talk about action. We need to fundamentally move into the space of innovation, where we're trying to do new things. And we're taking some long, hard looks at all of the information we already know. We know what needs to be done. We have for a long time. We need to move forward, and we need to do that with action. A reconciliation lens means that we're going to have an appropriate response for the emergency that's been declared. When there was flooding in the Southern Lakes this summer, it was an obvious response. The Army was called in. There was significant resources deployed almost immediately. When COVID hit, we saw the governments come together and make some pretty rapid changes pretty quickly. We need to see the same thing with this crisis. We have to really focus, I think, inclusively on making sure that education, justice, healthcare, everybody, the whole entire system is working and working quickly. I want to move into just quickly indigenization. What does it look like when we talk about incorporating Yukon First Nation worldviews into this work? At its core, indigenization is the concept of making sure that we embed Yukon First Nation ways of knowing, being, and doing into all of the work that we do. It's about making sure that the spaces we're having any type of treatment in are culturally reflected. It's about making sure that the programs and services understand what Yukon First Nation realities are and how to make them work. It's about making sure that when we're talking about new policies and new approaches, that they aren't going to be contrary to the way Yukon First Nation people would do the things that they would do. The only way we can make sure that we are working truly in partnership and that indigenization is at the key is if we work with a reconciliation lens. I just want to spend a little bit of time on what does that look like when we're on the ground. Well, not a new concept for the Yukon. It looks like on the land treatment. It looks like treatment that's deeply connected to the place that we call home. From a Yukon First Nation perspective, we are at our strongest when we're deeply connected to the land. We're at our weakest when we have no connection to the land. And yet that's pretty contrary to how we see lots of the treatment options rolling out for people right now, and the suicide prevention conversations and the mental health and wellness conversations. And so we need to find a way to do this. I have been involved in several conversations over the last couple of years where First Nations are saying, we know what we need. We need on the land treatment programs in our communities. We need programs that understand the Yukon First Nation ways and that they're deeply embedded in those ways. So an indigenized approach to this would take this into account. It would move away from a traditional Western approach of putting people into a building and talking about wellness in there. It would have a space where we could have our knowledge holders, our ceremonies, all of those things happen. An indigenized approach to mental wellness would be holistic. It would incorporate all aspects of the human being, the way that we can be our best people. It would talk about our physical needs, our emotional needs, our spiritual needs, and our intellectual needs. And it would look after the entire person. It wouldn't just be focused on the physical or the emotional. We often see people shy away from that spiritual piece. But if we're truly going to look at something with an Indigenous perspective, then we need to incorporate that as well. Ceremony. Ceremony is incredibly powerful. It needs to be at the center of a lot of these conversations. It is something that we need to revitalize and bring back and to honor when it exists. But yet we still see people shy away from incorporating ceremony into different programs. And we see this, well, we can't have ceremony here. The space isn't designed for it, or we don't want to make anybody uncomfortable. If we're truly going to do this in partnership with a reconciliation lens, then we look for opportunities to be able to bring these things together. An indigenized response to mental health and mental wellness in the territory recognizes that from a First Nation perspective, all things are interconnected. That our family is interconnected with ourselves, with our communities, with our nation, with our territory. I come from one of the biggest families in the Yukon, and I can tell you every day that impacts my mental well-being. I feel supported. I feel like I can reach out, and that's important. I have responsibilities for my family. I have responsibilities for my nation, I have responsibilities for, of course, my next generation. So how do we take that into account when we're designing programs, when we're coming up with solutions, when we're trying new things? That interconnectedness becomes really important. We saw this play out in the territory because every one of those young people that we've lost recently and before are so interconnected. Every community is hurting. Those people don't belong just to one community, they belong to entire nations and huge families. And so our heart breaks every time there's a loss. And if we don't have the time to recognize the interconnectedness, then I'm afraid that the solutions we come up with won't actually be relevant or effective or accessible. I like this quote by an Anishinaabe elder. To heal a nation, we must first heal the individuals, the families, and the communities. We must remember that from an Indigenous perspective, the entire nation needs to be healed. The community needs to be healed. It doesn't do us any good if one or two people are well, when there's others who are hurting. And so how do we take a more collective approach to solving the significant mental health issues that we've got going on? That our approaches need to be strength-based. Just like the feathers that we're showing here, one feather is just as important as the other, but all together, it's those feathers when they're combined, the collective that gives the power of flight. And so the piece that we're talking about in terms of strength, what is the strength of all of us together? That every person, no matter where they're from or what their circumstances, they have strengths to offer. A Yukon First Nation perspective would say that every single individual that's born into this world, that's brought into this place, has the potential, and our job is to help them reach that potential, to make this world a better place. Lots of the elders that I've had an honor of working with have told us that the best thing that we can ever hope to achieve is that when we pass, to have made this world a better place. How do we give people the skills to do that in a good way? How do we recognize that Indigenous people have an important role to play in these conversations, and we need to support them to reach their potential? So where do we go from here? Well, like I said, I don't think we don't have the answers, or I think we have the answers already. We've known for a long time that we need to change things up. We need to have significant investments, and it needs to be driven from the communities. We need to focus on harm reduction. We need to make some brave, courageous, innovative decisions, and we have the power to do that. COVID has shown us that we can do that. We can pivot quickly in this territory. We need to focus on prevention. We need to really amplify the investments in things like a solid education system, because we know research tells us for every dollar we put into that system, the return is incredible. Right now, the vast majority of us have to go outside if we're looking for treatment, whether that be for addictions or for other mental health issues. That can't keep being that way. We know that we need to have some resources here on the ground in our communities that are run by the communities, and we have to make those changes. We can do that. We know we can do that. We've done it before. We need to have a deep conversation about what wraparound supports look like. It sounds awful, but it's common in my life where people were coming back from treatment and they were met at the airport with a six-pack. It doesn't do us any good to send people out to treatment if we can't support them when they get home, and we can't build the pieces that are so instrumental for them when they come home, so they've got an easier journey. So what does that look like? It looks like some of the First Nations across the country that are committing to their people. If you go for treatment and you successfully complete, we will have a house for you when you come home. We will have an employment opportunity or an education opportunity for you come home. We will have people that will hold you up and surround you with the love and the support that you need to make these important changes, that you are an important part of our community, and we're going to show you that. It means that we're going to recognize that you don't just have to come to Whitehorse to get these services, that you don't have to just have an internet or a cell phone or any of these other pieces to get these services, that we're going to meet you where you're at in your context, and that it's going to be okay. And that we're going to provide those services somehow to make sure that they're relevant and they're accessible where you are and where you want to be. We had an opportunity, my business partner and I, to work with youth across the territory this summer. We got to work with the Arctic Youth, Western Arctic Youth Collective. And really our goal was to try and start a conversation with the youth about how to prevent suicide. What are the things the youth wanted to see? So there was a resolution that was passed by CYFN leadership a couple of years ago. And we took that resolution out to the youth, and they did what youth did. They amazed us. And they said, we don't want to develop a strategy. Strategies are important, but we want action. We want a way to make sure that we can drive change. And so when they came back and at the end of the conversations over the summer, here are a few things that they said that they wanted to see happen in the territory to help them deal with mental wellness and suicide prevention from a youth perspective. They need some capacity in trauma-informed care. and a trauma-informed approach. How do we get our youth in that skill set so that they understand how they can do that? They need tools for their communities. They need them to be relevant for their context. What works in Burwash is not going to work in Carmax, is not going to work in Ross. It needs to be flexible, it needs to be innovative. Our youth know that. They're saying they need more opportunities for safe, brave space for youth to have these conversations. They need them to be explicitly there for them and intentionally there for them. They need to better know how to meet young people where they're at, how to build guidelines and principles and best practices and things to avoid. We're not in a bubble in this conversation. We just have to look to our neighbors in BC to know that they're struggling with a number of the same issues in Indigenous communities. We just have to look out to the east to see what's happening in Nunavut with suicide prevention, some of the success that they've had. But we need to help our youth in gathering these best practices and use what's been learned across this country and, in fact, other areas so that we can build the best that we can build. These activities need to be land-based. Our youth told us loud and clear they feel the strongest when they're out on the land and they're learning and they're connected from knowledge holders out there. We need a way and tools for youth to address lateral violence so that the youth voice can help with that intergenerational trauma and the results of it. We are deeply concerned, and the youth are deeply concerned, specifically about support for our young men. It is our young men that have a harder time finding where they can go, housing, supports that are specific for them. And so that was an important concern for them. Wanted to share with you what the youth said, because I think we don't always give them the space that they need in these sessions and these conversations, these dialogues, and in designing the solutions. And so I think from a reconciliation lens and an indigenization lens, we recognize that our youth are just as important as our knowledge holders, just as important as our elders, and that their voice and perspectives must be considered along the way. My time, it's just about 20 after 11. I put together a number of resources that have come up over the years through this work and with First Nations. Just happy to share them. I think there's some really good principles in these resources that we can use here. But I want to move towards taking some questions, if that's okay. I think Tracy's online and she'll help us navigate these questions as they come. Feel free to reach out after the conference. I'm not hard to find, so my email address is tosh@irppotential.com. Happy to share that piece. And I would hope, if you can, by all means, take the resources and explore them and see how they might fit into the conversations that are happening right now. So no questions yet, Tracy's saying to me. Encourage you to think of brave questions if you've got them. You can ask anything, safe space. I think one of the other pieces that we often really want to encourage when we're talking about working in a reconciliation space is that ability to create the room for important dialogue. We often, everybody knows what the moose in the room is, but do we create the space to have those difficult conversations? Because how are we going to come up with good solutions if we're not even able to talk about the moose in the room in a good way and address those issues as they come across?
And I do want to remind everyone as well that if you don't have a question at the moment, but something comes to you later, there is a feedback form embedded on this session on the conference platform. So if you think of anything later, please feel free to ask that question in there and we can direct that to Tosh.
Thanks, Candace. I appreciate that. Yeah, absolutely happy to answer and engage on this important conversation. I think this is one of the pieces that's kept me up at night last year and this year in particular. And I think it's going to take all hands on deck to come up with some good ways forward and move on them and do that action piece that people are desperately needing.
Absolutely. It's going to take a lot of collaboration.
Good. So Tracy's got a question. From your opinion, how can we make sure the summit ends up in creating action? That's a great question. And my answer is to frame the conversations around action. I don't think, I would say be resistant to the idea that we do another study. Be resistant to the idea that we host, weeks long of dialogues. Be very receptive to say, let's talk about the experts that are already here in the territory and those that are showing best practices. And let's have the courage to be innovative and try some things and give permission for people to fail. It cannot get worse than it is right now. So trying anything, whether that be from technology perspective, whether that be from innovative programs in the communities. I think if you give that permission out there for people to try things so that we can see what works here in this context is there. And then I think lastly, make it Indigenous led. The First Nations are ready for action. They will bring that piece on there. If we give them the resources they need and the help and the support to bring to fruition what their solutions are, it will result in action. Great question. Any other ones that are out there? I'm hoping that you guys are getting some inspiring conversations about what's possible. I'm curious if you can share an example of a well-loved land-based activity for youth. Absolutely. Any type of harvesting camp, those were incredibly popular with the youth. Any way of learning ancestral technologies and the ways that have been done before, very popular with youth. I think we are also seeing the youth really exploring storytelling and bringing that back, whether that's through films or podcasts or dance. This idea that ceremony and storytelling are so central for Yukon First Nations, and the youth are really embracing that and bringing that part in, so that technology piece plays an important role in these conversations. I think the other thing with land-based activities is that we really need to recognize that there's so much opportunity to do that in the communities. It's one of the strengths that the communities have. And so how do you create the infrastructure, the toolbox, whatever they need to be able to make that happen on their own? And that can be really empowering for sure. Great question. Any other comments or questions out there? Appreciate the note regarding sent out for treatment. I wonder, has YG and Whitehorse First Nation leaders looked at connecting on how to fund local treatment centers? So there is Jackson Lake for sure with Quanlan Dunn, but I would really encourage people to look at treatment centers outside of Whitehorse. I myself have gone to treatment. It's not an easy thing to go down that road, period, let alone having to go outside. And I can't imagine how horrifying it is, particularly for youth. It's also a reality that Yukon is a very, we often talk about how unique we are. Well, we are unique. We are a jurisdiction that has lots of different contexts than other places. And so, the treatment places, they need to reflect that, and they need to be accessible. And it's scary to have to go out for a number of months, especially if you're looking for family options. It's not easy to find these places. And so I don't think the answer is to just have more spots down south. The answer is to build healing centers here, and broadly, not just treatment centers, but healing centers here, and have them culturally relevant. Great question. Anything else anybody wants to explore? I think we've got, by my watch, 5 minutes left. Not enough time, but enough time for a couple more questions. Did the youth have any suggestions for actions they would like to see in their communities? Absolutely. So one of the conversations we had was this idea that they need supports in order for an innovation fund. So they've got ideas, but they need people to help them bring them to fruition. How to write, a one-page proposal. They don't need people to come and approach them to fix them. Lots of times we get people who come with the best of intentions, but they come from a perspective that we're broken. And that can be really hard. And the youth, when we got the chance to hear from them, said, do we know how to do these things? And we have lots of ideas. We just need the supports to do it. We need the money to do it. We need help on the reporting pieces. We need to understand how to do these event plannings. Where's the support to do those things in our communities? And I think they're, the other piece that they're really important or really looking for with actions is this ability to respect their time, their opinions, their strengths. And build that into the conversations that we're having. Thanks, Jeff. What can it look like to indigenize space? Oh, fantastic question. So to indigenize space, first we have to understand which Indigenous group we're looking at. But I'll give you some examples. If you had a chance, you can go up to Yukon University. There's a new learning commons up there. That learning commons had several elders have significant input into what it could look like and really redefined that space. It looks like bringing the outdoors in. It looks like creating open access so you can go right outside. It looks like sustainable buildings, respecting the land, minimal impact. It looks like making sure that when you walk in, you understand that you're in the traditional territory, and that Vancouver Airport's a great example. If you look at Vancouver Airport compared to Newark, that's an Indigenized space? Fantastic question. How can we do land-based program for all Yukoners? We are all connected. 100% we're all connected. And I think that's the question, right? Very few people live to the Yukon because of the amazing shopping. We're here because we like this lifestyle. We're here because this is an amazing place to be. And so land-based treatment isn't just for First Nations. It is about a Northern concept of wellness. And I think that we should be opening up land-based programming for all. These healing centers need to be for everybody. But I do think we need to prioritize Indigenous communities. The loss that we're seeing for First Nations is so significant that we need to have, again, I go back to that graphic I put up about equity and justice, and have that underpin all of the conversations that we do about programming. I don't know if the 1 minute was for me, Jeff, or it was for everybody. Oh, thanks, Jeff. Oh, I appreciate the time, and I'm glad that there's a good response out here, and there's a lot of you participating and pushing this forward. It gives me some hope that things can move forward.
Thank you very much, Tosh, for joining us today. And again, everyone, if you have any other questions, please leave those on the feedback form, and Tosh will be able to answer those for you later.